Hello everybody. Today we are going to start with modernism. Modernism is a period of is a literary movement that developed in the first half of the 20th century. In order to understand modernism, first we should make a distinction between modernity and modernism. Modernity refers to a historical period, is an epochal term, and it points out the time between 1492, the discovery of America, until 1950 or the 60s. Whereas modernism refers to a cultural construct, and it is just one of the aesthetics, cultural manifestations of modernity. We generally say that it begins around the 1910s or 1922, and it points to a moment of crisis. The term modernism embraces all the creative arts, especially poetry, fiction, drama, as well as painting and architecture. The most important characteristic of the movement is extreme diversity. There is no single school which can be said to typify the age. Modernism then is a sort of umbrella term for many isms or small movements that follow one after the other. The diversity is only one aspect of the general diversity in social development in the 20th century. As regards the social-political background, this time is characterized by despair, anxiety, and uncertainty. In the same way that when we studied Romanticism, we said that that was the age of revolutions, when we think of modernism, we think of the age of despair, anxiety, and uncertainty. And this is so because this is a period where many wars took place. 1914, 1918, the First World War was fought, and that was a war fought to put an end to all wars. And if we look at the screen, that was not the case. 1917, we have the Russian Revolution, 1922 to 23, the Irish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, the Spanish Civil War, and finally 1939-1945, the Second World War. So, after these wars, there was this air of despair. Many lives were lost, and in fact, peace was never achieved. Now, which are the cultural sources that paved the way to modernism? Among them, we can mention Einstein and his theory of relativity. Time and space are not as constant as everyday life may suggest, and that had an impact on those artists, especially those that wanted to move away from realism. Remember that realists wanted to portray reality as if it were a photographic representation, so the portrayal of time and space was true to life. With Einstein and his theory of relativity, that change in the way time and space were dealt with in literary texts. Karl Marx, in his text, depicted history as a series of class struggles, and he challenged capitalism, because he believed that workers were no longer willing to accept a subordinate role, and this is very well reflected in the production of many artists. Marxists believed that literature was not a matter of personal taste, but should relate to the social and political conditions of the time. In the field of psychology, Nietzsche argued that the Enlightenment has eliminated the idea of God. So God is dead. For him, Europe no longer needed God as a source for all morality, value, or order in the universe. Philosophy and science were capable of doing that for us. In the case of Bergson, he emphasized the importance of instinct over reason, and Freud studied the unconscious, the workings of the mind at the pre-speech level, and the suppressed sexual element in human behavior. So how did these thinkers influence modern writers? As scientific explanations were more subtle and harder to understand, the modernist writer was faced with a very complex reality and needed to put order into the chaos that surrounded him. Which are the main characteristics of the period? There was a feverish pursuit of meaning and values because there was a need to organize human response to the chaotic conditions of life. There was also a need to adjust human consciousness to a rapidly changing, disconcerting, and disturbing world. For example, the sense of local community was being lost as there was a greater anonymity of the individual in the urban context. Society became much more fragmented and individuals' identities were much more fluid. The mass destruction of the First World War led many towards extreme affiliations such as fascism and Marxism that were very attractive for many of the intellectuals and workers, particularly during the 1930s. There was a decay of faith and a spiritual emptiness and a loss of moral sanctity as a result of the wars that were fought at this time. Regardless of the diversity of the different small movements or isms, they all share some characteristics. There was a tendency towards abstraction that started, as we have already seen, in the realm of painting. In poetry, for example, the metaphor evolved to finally become an image, as we will see later on with imagism. The image became an autonomous entity, and sometimes the link between the two objects of the metaphor was so weak that the anchorage to reality was lost. This characteristic is closely connected to that of the self-sufficiency of the work of art and the alienation of the artist. So, the work of art had meaning in itself independently of the author's intention or the reader's intention. The more advanced the poet became, the more alienated he was from the mass population. His works were very obscure for the average reader, and they demanded greater effort to appreciate the more complex form of expression, and this is related to the last characteristics of modernist art. Writers wanted to experiment, so it was a question of innovation, a breaking from tradition, rupture, and novelty. They believed that the previous traditional forms of art were exhausted, so they were for art's sake, and no concessions were made to the reader. So, technical experimentation, as I said before, had to do with the belief that traditional forms were exhausted, so they were willing to make use of the contributions of science and philosophy. For example, they experimented with the interior monologue, which is one of the techniques of the stream of consciousness style. They wanted to reproduce in writing the way the human mind worked, which resulted in texts that were fragmented, because when we think at the pre-speech level, we don't think in logical units, and we don't think with punctuation marks, and all this was reflected in the literary texts. They also used poetic prose, which was the idea of combining poetry together with prose. They made use of symbols, and they kept on using free verse. And in fact, they started using free verse, which meant neither rhyme nor rhythm. Remember that the Romantics gave the first step when they did away with rhyme and they only kept rhythm. Now, poets were started writing with free verse, neither rhyme nor rhythm. There was a dislocation of syntax that brought about fragmentation not only in form but also in context. There was also the inclusion of foreign languages in different texts. Ezra Pound, as one of the key names in modernism, could write, for example, and he could insert complete lines or verses written in French or in German. And this, together with the use of intertextuality to compress meaning or to broaden semantic repercussions, make the text quite obscure for those readers who did not have a command of many foreign languages or were not well read in the classics. We can also see the use of paradox, ambiguity, and irony. So, what was the result? There was an elitist detachment of the artist. The artist was not writing to be understood, but he was making art for art's sake. So, the obscurity in the expression of ideas led that these texts were read by an elite, and very often these modernist writers would get together and they would read to one another their texts. We will see in many of the texts that very often the same story was told from different perspectives. So we had several poetic voices in the same text or several narrators. The use of an impersonal poetic voice also conveyed this detachment of the artist. It was not a sort of autobiographical writing, but the artist, and we will see when we study T.S. Eliot, was supposed to fly away from personality. He did not have a personality to express, but a personality to escape from. Which are the main themes that were dealt with in modernist literature? There was a criticism on the futility and sterility of society. It was a time of great consumption and materialism. Most literary texts depicted human beings that felt isolated, lonely, and they were in despair. There were human beings that were in search of meaning and significance of life, and it was impossible for them to find it. There was an expression of disillusionment and disgust, and an awareness of social evils and moral suffering. So, in general, these are most of the themes the literary texts dealt with. Then we will see in the different small movements under the big umbrella of modernism how each of them, imagism, cubism, surrealism, imagism, etc., deal with these themes in terms of form. Okay? I hope you have understood and that I have been clear enough.